The Detroit Lions may have a major decision to make at cornerback, and it is one that could immediately change the conversation surrounding this defense. A new possibility has emerged involving Joey Porter Jr. And the question is simple: if the Pittsburgh Steelers are truly willing to move him, should Detroit make a serious attempt to bring him in? According to the information surrounding the situation, Porter is approaching the end of his current contract situation and could eventually be looking for a significant new deal. That is where the biggest question begins for the Lions. Detroit may be interested in adding another talented corner, but acquiring a player is only part of the equation. The team would also have to consider whether it could financially support another major contract while already having several important players and long-term investments across the roster. And that makes this situation fascinating for Lions fans. Detroit has already explored different ways of improving the cornerback position. The team has tried adding players through free agency. It has tried investing in the draft. But the possibility of trading for a proven player who already has NFL experience presents a completely different approach. The idea is not necessarily about finding another young prospect and hoping he develops. It would be about identifying a player who has already shown he can compete at this level and potentially adding him to a roster that is trying to take another step forward. The question, however, is whether Joey Porter Jr. would be worth the cost. The cornerback market is becoming increasingly expensive. Several top players at the position have received massive contracts, with deals reaching more than $30 million per year. That reality cannot be ignored. If Detroit were to acquire Porter, the Lions would eventually have to consider what his next contract could look like and whether that investment would fit into the team's larger financial picture. But there is another side to this discussion. Detroit's defense showed several encouraging signs in the preseason game against the Washington Commanders. DJ Reed played well. Roger McCreary also had a positive performance. At the same time, the question remains whether the Lions have enough overall depth and high-end talent in the secondary to feel completely comfortable moving forward without making another addition. That is why a potential trade becomes such an interesting debate. Would Detroit be better off keeping its draft capital and continuing to develop the players already on the roster? Or should the Lions follow the philosophy of using draft picks to acquire proven NFL talent when the right opportunity becomes available? A proven player can sometimes provide more certainty than a draft pick, but every trade comes with a price. And in this case, the financial implications could be just as important as the compensation sent to Pittsburgh. The possibility becomes even more intriguing when you look at what Detroit showed against Washington, especially on the defensive side of the football. One player who immediately stood out was Skylar Gill-Howard. He may not have the biggest frame on the field, but his energy and explosiveness were difficult to ignore. He played with speed, attacked the action, and consistently looked active. He appears to have the profile of an undersized defensive lineman, but he also showed the kind of quickness that can allow a player to create problems for opposing offenses. Then there was Jackson Meeks. At first glance, it might be easy to assume that his path to making the roster is difficult because of the talent already ahead of him, but there was something noticeable about his performance. He showed some potential, some energy, and enough ability to make people wonder whether there could be more to his game as he continues to develop. Sometimes a player does not need to immediately look like a finished product to make an impression. Sometimes all he needs to do is show that there is something worth watching. Taven Williams was another player who made an impact after recently joining the team. Whether it was through screenplays or runs, he brought some life to the offense. His performance also reflects something interesting about the evolution of Detroit's roster. The Lions appear to have improved the depth of their running back room, particularly when comparing the current options deeper on the roster with previous years. And then we get to the player who may have generated the strongest reaction of all, Derek Moore. Derek Moore looked different. He appeared bigger than expected. He looked strong. He looked fast. More importantly, he looked like he belonged on the field. For a young player, that is one of the most important things you can show. It was not simply about making one play or getting one favorable matchup. The overall impression was that Moore has real potential to become an impact player in Detroit's defensive rotation, and the Lions may not even need him to carry a huge workload immediately. That is what makes his situation so exciting. Detroit has veterans who can handle responsibilities while younger players continue to develop. DJ Wanham is available to contribute, while Peyton Turner was mentioned as another offseason addition who is currently dealing with an injury. That could allow more to enter games in specific situations, attack opponents with fresh energy, create problems, and continue developing without being asked to become a superstar overnight. He could potentially provide important depth while also giving the Lions another player with significant upside. The same general idea applies to other players along the defensive front. Detroit does not necessarily need every young contributor to immediately become a dominant star. Some players can provide steady production while developing over time, but with Moore, there appears to be a feeling that his ceiling could be different. There is something about his performance that makes you stop and wonder just how much more he could become. And if the Lions truly have an improved defensive line and a strong group at linebacker, that brings us right back to the original question. Could one more significant addition in the secondary complete another important piece of the defense? Because that is the conversation surrounding Joey Porter Jr. Detroit may already have players who can contribute at cornerback. The preseason performance against Washington provided encouraging signs, but if a proven corner becomes available, the Lions would have to decide whether this is the type of opportunity that is worth pursuing. The challenge would be balancing the immediate benefit of adding another talented player against the cost of a potential trade and the financial commitment that could eventually follow. So what do you think, Lions fans? If Joey Porter Jr. is truly available, would you want Detroit to make a trade for him, especially after what you have seen from this defense and from Derek Moore? But the excitement around Derek Moore was not the only thing that stood out. The Detroit Lions also have several other important questions developing across the roster, and some of them could have a major impact on how far this team can go. Tay Martin made plays and continued to show that there are players fighting for opportunities throughout the roster. At the same time, Isaac Tisla had a very different afternoon. He played 27 snaps and was not targeted a single time. That becomes even more interesting when you consider that he had dropped 2 passes in the previous game. That does not necessarily mean there is a reason to panic about Tisla. The bigger question is how Detroit should use him. He has the kind of profile that could make him especially dangerous when the ball is simply put in the air and he is given an opportunity to make a play. Instead of expecting him to immediately become a player who runs every route and consistently creates separation in every situation, perhaps there are specific ways to maximize what makes him different. Deep routes, back shoulder throws, and situations where the quarterback can simply give him a chance to go up and make a contested play could potentially become valuable weapons. That is what makes his development so interesting. Sometimes a player does not need the entire offense designed around him. Sometimes he just needs to be placed in situations that allow his best traits to take over. If Detroit can eventually find those situations for Tisla, there could be something important there. The offensive line is another area that deserves serious attention. Miles Frazier and Larry Borom were described as average in their play, but the bigger conversation is about the interior of the offensive line. The Lions know exactly how important that group is to everything they want to accomplish. The offense will only go as far as the offensive line allows it to go. At center, Juice Scruggs remains a major player to watch. Seth McLaughlin was also discussed, with concerns about whether he has the same athleticism, size, and strength as some of the other options. That does not mean McLaughlin cannot provide value. He can still be a useful backup and someone who can survive in the lineup if needed, but the bigger hope is that Scruggs can establish himself and provide stability at center, and that position matters enormously. Detroit went through uncertainty at center last season, and nobody wants to see that situation become a continuing problem. The Lions need someone who can hold down the position, especially during the early part of the season. The discussion in the source makes it clear that the offensive line still has questions, even if there are also reasons for optimism. The left guard position must continue to develop. The right guard position, however, appears to be much further ahead than it was at this point last year. There was a reminder of how difficult things looked during the opening game against Green Bay, when Detroit struggled and offensive line clips raised serious concerns. The hope now is that the right guard situation is much more stable. At right tackle, there appears to be confidence. At left tackle, the source expresses even stronger confidence, describing that player as one of the best offensive linemen in football. But center remains a position that deserves close attention. Can Juice Scruggs become the answer? Can he hold down the position and give Detroit the stability it needs? That could be one of the most important questions for the Lions moving forward, because the offense depends heavily on the line being able to control games, protect the quarterback, and create opportunities everywhere else. And when you put all of these conversations together, together, the bigger picture becomes extremely interesting. You have a potential trade discussion at cornerback involving Joey Porter Jr. You have encouraging performances from players like Skylar Gill-Howard. You have Derek Moore showing flashes that could suggest a much higher ceiling. You have young players fighting for roster positions. You have questions about how to best use Isaac Tisla. And you have an offensive line that appears to be making progress, but still needs answers in some critical positions. That is what makes this period so important. Every preseason performance can change the conversation. Every young player who steps onto the field has an opportunity to force the coaching staff to pay attention. And sometimes a player does not need to become a starter immediately to make a major impact. Derek Moore could be one of those examples. If he can continue developing while contributing in specific situations, Detroit could suddenly have another dangerous piece in its defensive rotation. And that brings us back to the cornerback question one final time. If the defensive line continues to develop the way it appears capable of doing, and if the linebacker group is strong from top to bottom, would adding another proven cornerback be the move that takes the defense to another level? Or should the Lions trust the players already in the building and use their resources elsewhere? That is the difficult balance. A trade for a proven player could provide an immediate upgrade, but it could also come with significant financial consequences. Detroit has to think not only about the next game or the next season, but about how every major contract affects the future of the roster. The encouraging part is that there are already players giving Lions fans